I'm a senior in economics in San Jose State here, and I'm also thinking about declaring a math minor because I'm very interested in math as well, as you can see from like the research. I actually transferred here about 4 semesters ago, so about like 2 years ago, back in the spring from De Anza College, and I also spent a little time at Foothill as well. Um, and I transferred into economics mostly because I was really interested in the intersection between kind of human behavior and like being able to quantify that. I kind of ponder about like psychology, sociology, and stuff like that, but ultimately I settled on economics. And then within the economics department and within San Jose State as well, I've kind of been involved in doing research. I've kind of helped out some of our professors doing some quantitative research, doing like data analysis, stuff like that. And I've also kind of been involved in the economics club and other campus organizations like that, including the entrepreneurship club. I'm also a really big fan of startups and innovation and stuff like that. Um, Getting started, that actually took me at least like a semester or so, but I was fortunate enough to stumble upon some resources online. Really had to like comb through like the San Jose State website and kind of just interface with the department a few times before I discovered some like research competitions and other opportunities like that. And so after either the first or second semester, I forget exactly which one, I had found out about a department-wide research paper competition. And so I entered in that, and I've actually entered like basically every single semester since the time that I had enrolled at San Jose State. And I ended up taking some prize money and kind of placing in the competition for a few of the semesters. And then that's how I actually got to know the professor who I started helping with data analysis and research, Dr. Matt Holian, because he was actually the one of the main like advisors for that competition. And so I submitted, I mean, my first semester I submitted like a regression analysis paper, like analyzing the relationship between certain like attributes. And it's basically, I called the paper was called Determinants of Attractiveness in a Dating Market. So we kind of analyzed like a Columbia University speed dating set. It was like, a few thousand rows of data, had like 50 columns of variables, and then just tried to like tease apart like what are people like looking for, like does age affect people's selectivity? Does gender affect selectivity? How are people's age and gender affect selectivity in terms of like income, major, people have major preferences. And so that was a really interesting study. And then more recently, I kind of did this, moved away from regression, but then the research that I did now was kind of more with like computer simulations. But I've stayed a lot with regression too, because with Matt Holian, I did analysis trying to find relationships between income and major earnings. So how much do econ majors make after you graduate and stuff like that? Kind of a relevant question for myself.
Right.
I think more specifically, Dr. Holian wanted to also explore the relationship between what your undergraduate major was and how much earnings you would have in like after graduate school. So, for example, one of the questions was, how much do lawyers make if they had an econ major? So, like, is econ a good major for law school, for example? And turns out is also a pretty decent major for law school. I think I like to try to think about research as like, you know, um, you try to find something that maybe you just like talk about with your friends, or like it's a question at a party or a bar, like just something like offhandedly, like maybe some pseudo intellectual question that you want to explore more in depth and more seriously. And then you can just take like what you learned in school and your classes, and within those parameters and those constraints and that like terminology, how can you define a problem and then like, explore that within the tools that you've learned in your classes? And so, between the attractiveness study, between like the investment study that I'll be talking about later, those were all just stuff that came up. And like, attractiveness, like something that is like, it's so commonplace. Like people are like dating all the time. So it's like just something in the back of my mind. I'm like, oh, I wonder if this affects this. And then the fact that I had learned Python in my Econ 103 class. Uh, I took that skill set, and right after that semester, I was like, oh, I could kind of practice what I learned in like coding and stuff like that this semester. And so I just applied it to that data set specifically. So really, it's just about like, everyone has interests and everyone has like some curiosities, and the question is like, can you kind of reconcile those with the tools that you've learned in school and within your field and major? That's a that's a really scenic route, but I'll talk about it quickly. Um, I started as a business major, and I say this in interviews too when I interview for full-time positions. But I always say I like to consider myself a non-traditional student. A little bit older. I spent maybe 3 or 4 years out of school, but when I first enrolled back, my my freshman year of college was in 2011, so it was a while back. Um, and I enrolled as a business major in the East Coast. There's a school called SUNY Binghamton, great business program, great accounting stuff, and I had a great time there. But I was just kind of like trying to discover stuff. And I think like at that time I was like younger, and I didn't utilize the resources of the university as well, and I like considered doing psychology major, maybe switching. I spent time out of school working. I learned some coding in my time out of school. I worked for a startup, so that was like kind of interesting. I pursued like entrepreneurial stuff, and then when I came back to school, I was just like, if I'm gonna come back to school, I want to like maximize, the opportunity here because it's an amazing opportunity, and there's like just limitless resources available on campus in general. And so when I came back and into economics, research and just get my name out there too, and kind of just like do good work. And then thankfully, I did end up finding a lot of resources in San Jose State, including this, the Dean's Colloquium, and finding like research opportunities in the department and competitions and stuff. And honestly, like just entering all of them have just been so fun. I used to play poker a lot, and that's a really great game. That's also an intersection of like quantitative and qualitative. There's like component of like psychology for like who you're playing against and what they're doing, and there's also a huge component of like probability there. There's like probabilistic outcomes, and there's like kind of the intersection of both that kind of informs poker strategy. But I also, spending some time with games of chance, I also got really curious about blackjack, and so I actually like, I would say, studied it for a bit, like informally, like reading a lot about blackjack, reading about like card counting, for example. And I discovered like that there were methods in blackjack that also applied, like there are blackjack players from like MIT who like discovered ways to like beat the probability of the game, who also like used those principles and transferred them to like investments. And so from my interest in investments and business, and from like my, kind of extracurricular experiences in blackjack, they kind of like merged together into this like project idea to try to like quantify optimal investments. Like if you have an opportunity in the stock market, if you have an opportunity in really anything, how much should you wager on this? And that's like a, interesting question, I think, for people who want to make money on their investments. I was supposed to have an internship this summer, but I was kind of moved virtually, and I was going to intern in IT consulting,
Uh-huh.
in like technology consulting at one of these kind of accounting firms, like consulting firms. And um, I think that's turning into like a full-time offer. So I'll probably be going into consulting. I'm really interested in like strategy. again, like business and, profitability and stuff. So that's where a lot of my research lies in, like kind of the human behavior section and kind of like human behavior and business as well, just like business related stuff. And I'm also thinking about doing graduate school, probably thinking about doing an MBA somewhere down the line because I love strategy so much. So the title of the presentation today and the research that I've been working on is called Finding Optimal Investment Strategies with Computer Simulations. Now, what is the main idea behind this research and kind of what we wanted to explore here? And the main idea, as the name implies, is like if you have a probabilistic outcome that you can wager a certain amount of money on, how much risk, given a certain risk of this probability and something occurring, whether winning or losing, how much should you bet on that, right? So this is very relevant for investment bankers, entrepreneurs, just a regular investor in general, because in many, many situations, countless situations in life, we're going to be faced with opportunities to allocate capital, and the optimal allocation of capital is going to shift your earnings potential in the long term. And so I kind of wanted to explore that more in depth in a quantitative manner. So the biggest, or maybe the best thought experiment that I like to pose when we first dive into this problem is a coin flip example. So just imagine for a moment, if you were to flip a coin and you have a 100% guarantee of winning, I want to ask you, the audience, the viewer, how much should you wager on this coin flip, right? And so people like usually think for a moment, and typically the response is you want to wager 100%. Because if you're 100% sure, for example, that the coin is going to land on heads, and someone's like, you can bet however much money you want to bet on this or invest, let's say. If you know that's going to land on heads, you should get all the money you have in your bank account and put it on this wager, this investment. And that's kind of an intuitive example to kind of to frame this problem. Now, perhaps a less intuitive solution and problem to consider is, what is the optimal amount to wager on this coin flip if you're only correct less than 100% of the time? So perhaps 60% of the time you're correct. Perhaps you know approximately that you only 70% of the time it's going to land on the heads. If that's the case, you still have an advantage because it's not a 50-50 coin flip, which, by the way, a 50-50 coin flip is you break even in the long term if you wager on that. So how much to bet on this? And what if there was a formula perhaps to determine the optimal amount to invest in order to maximize the growth rate of your capital in the long term? Now, there is in fact a formula, and that's called the Kelly criterion. This was actually discovered by John Kelly in 1956. He was a researcher at Bell Labs, which is currently known as AT&T, really big back in the mid-1900s. And he had a thought experiment which related to horse racing, actually. And the idea was, if you had an inside tip on which horse was going to win, how much money should you be placing to make the most money, right? And so the formula is named the Kelly criterion after him. And it is the formula that dictates what is the percentage of your wealth, of your total wealth to wager, given the probabilities of winning and losing, right? So the most simple form of it, there's like more complex derivations, but the simplest form for a 1-to-1 payout for odds, which means if you bet $100, you're getting 200 back if you win, or basically they pay you 100 in winnings if you wager 100. The simplest formula given those situations is, if you look here, F star equals P minus Q. The F star is the percentage of the wealth to bet, and P is the chance of winning, and Q is the chance of losing. So as we saw with the original coin flip example, the intuitive one, if you have a 100% chance of winning, which is P, and a 0% chance of losing, F star equals 100%. And so that formula kind of validates the whole intuition. behind how much you should wager on a guaranteed win. Now, of course, if there's a 60% chance of winning, the formula also dictates that a percentage of what that you should wager, which is 60% minus a 40% chance of losing, gives you a 20% chance of 20% wealth allocation that you should place on the specific probabilistic situation. Now, moving on, how does Kelly criterion tie into the research that I'm going to conduct, or that I have conducted? We want to see, what I wanted to see specifically was if I took computer simulations and simulated a game with many different players at different strategies and like over millions of trials, does the kind of experimental result approximate the numerical result? So do we get close to what John Kelly dictates? And also, like, what are the results in general? Like, what, like, how many people end up losing? How many people end up winning? What is, like, you know, the overall big picture when we run these simulations? You just want to look at the results. And so the game that I set up, when I coded, and I ended up coding in Python, is to take a hypothetical investment opportunity in a game with a 3% advantage, right? It's a very small advantage. It's a 51%, roughly 51.5% winning ratio and a 48.5% losing chance. So we have a program bet on the 5,000 rounds of the game, and it uses a fraction of what the Kelly criterion recommends. So if we use the F star formula and it tells us, you know, you should bet 3%, then the strategy also bets several different percentages of Kelly. So if Kelly criterion at 100% says bet 3%, we also bet 3%, we bet half of 3%, which is 1.5, and we bet like half of that, you know? And then basically we simulate a bunch of different people just to aggregate the results and see what, you know, as a whole, how does the strategy perform? Because one person might not kind of illustrate the mathematics effectively. But if you have like 1,000 people, 10,000 people betting on the situation, the aggregate results will give you a better idea of what the average is. So in total, you know, using different strategies and betting a few thousand rounds with a few thousand different hypothetical players, we ended up simulating 25 million bets with 5 different investment strategies. And the investment strategies, again, just to reiterate, are really just different levels of Kelly criterion. So this is betting at 100% or the maximum of what the formula recommends. This is betting over what the formula recommends. And this is betting like under a certain percentage of what the formula recommends. And how does that perform? This is just one simulation of one player. So this is one player who bet 5,000 trials. And after 5,000 trials, now again, this can be anything. This could be 5,000 rounds of blackjack. This could be 5,000 hands of poker. This could be 5,000 days as a trader, right, with a certain percentage edge. And you can see that in the specific simulation, the earnings goes from, I started off this player with like $100 and they 18 times their wealth. It ends at roughly, if you look at the y-axis, around $1,600 to $1,800. Now taking that simulation, that idea, I want to transition over to what, as a whole, as an aggregate, what the entire simulation and program does. It takes one of these simulations and it does that basically 1,000 more times. And then we average what the earnings are. Because one player could just be an anomaly, but we want to see if we average what everyone does, what are your personal odds after we have 1,000 different simulations? So if you look here, this is the aggregation of those results, and it forms a bell curve. This is actually a log normal bell curve, so it's transformed from an exponential. It's transformed from an exponential distribution to a normal. And from this, you can see kind of the probability of how much you would earn. And the x-axis is the earnings. The y-axis is like how many people, how many of those 1,000 players ended up earning that amount. And so you can see on the left and the right. On the left, we have betting at the maximum of the Kelly formula. And on the right-hand side, we have betting at half of the Kelly. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the results because they're really interesting. But they're both hovering roughly around e to the 10, because this is, again, the log scale. So this is on the bottom, the x-axis. The mean is at e to the 10, which is roughly, it's, I think, over like 20,000, roughly maybe 30 to 40,000. But each player has played 5,000 rounds, and there's 1,000 players, and this is the result of each 1,000 players playing those rounds. And let me just dive a little bit into the results because they're quite interesting and quite relevant for the investor. So according to Kelly criterion, the investor who's betting the full Kelly at the maximum Kelly is going to return roughly around 130%, starting with $10,000. You're going to end up with roughly around 23,000. So the interesting thing is that betting the maximum amount that the formula recommends and betting half the amount the formula recommends still results in a pretty similar average earnings. So the loss for betting half of what the formula recommends, so being more conservative, actually it only reduces your average by, there's only a difference between those two average earnings by like 10%. But the variance, so how much you could potentially lose and how much you could potentially win, is drastically shrunk. So of course there are like lower probability of you 20 timesing, like kind of like multiplying your wealth by 20 times. There's much lower probability of that happening, but at least your average earnings are not hit as hard. And you also reduce your likelihood of losing large sums of money. Finally, what's also interesting is that betting more than what the formula recommends results in bigger swings, more variance, and a much lower average return. And so essentially, we can kind of transition here into the discussion, which is like, what do these results mean for the typical investor? And we can see that although it seems a bit obvious, perhaps, or intuitive that being conservative in your investment is better, that's not necessarily the case. It's more so that there is a quantifiable way to quantify what is the optimal amount to invest. And in fact, it's not always good to be conservative, because if you have a guaranteed gain, as I noted several times in the early part of the presentation, it's actually not good to be conservative because you're losing out on the potential to win. If you have a 100% chance of winning and you're not betting all of your money, you're just losing out on the opportunity, like a guaranteed opportunity, really. So the lesson here from the research is that we can verify that Kelly criterion does in fact perform effectively, and then we can also look at the experimental difference between what the Kelly dictates and experimentally what happens in the real life. The difference between the theoretical and the experimental. And we also see, and we also verify that being overzealous and betting over what the Kelly criterion recommends is disadvantageous. It's kind of not advantageous in any manner. And betting less than Kelly can be advantageous, but it really depends on your risk profile. And so depending on your preferences for earnings or your preferences for risk, the investor has to consider those options when placing an investment on some probabilistic outcome, because you're trading off different variables here. Either you want bigger swings and bigger earnings, or maybe you want slightly lower earnings and you don't want to risk losing it all. because betting full Kelly, you have a greater chance of losing all your money. And that's just the bottom line. And so at the end of the day, I can leave the viewer with, and what the research ultimately says is that there is no such thing as a sure thing, typically. But using probability, investors and entrepreneurs and anyone interested in allocating their wealth can maximize their wealth if they're properly informed and if they're able to be conscientious of this formula.